The diner buzzed with low chatter and the clinking of silverware against ceramic plates. It was the kind of roadside stop where time seemed to stand still. Faded red booths, a jukebox in the corner that hadn't played a song in years, and the smell of fried bacon hanging thick in the air. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low, spilling golden light through the blinds, painting the cracked linoleum floor with streaks of orange. At a corner booth, an older man sat alone, his weathered hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug. He looked to be in his 70s, maybe older, his face carved with deep lines that told a lifetime of stories no one had asked to hear. His name was Frank Callahan, but to anyone passing by, he was just another quiet figure blending into the background. Frank was dressed simply, a faded denim jacket, a worn-out hat pulled low over his eyes, and boots that had clearly walked more miles than he cared to remember. He was nursing his coffee, staring out the window with a gaze that was both distant and sharp, like he could see far beyond the horizon. But there was something about him that made people pause. A quiet intensity in the way he carried himself. He wasn't loud, wasn't trying to draw attention, yet you couldn't help but notice the way he seemed to own the space around him without saying a word. The door slammed open, breaking the calm, and a group of bikers strolled in. Leather jackets, loud laughter, and the unmistakable smell of trouble. They weren't locals. That much was obvious. As they stomped in, scanning the room like they owned it, one of them caught sight of Frank. The leader, a burly guy with a snake tattoo winding around his neck, grinned. "Well, well," he said loudly, his voice cutting through the diner's quiet. "Looks like we've got ourselves a real cowboy over here." Frank didn't look up. His fingers tightened slightly around his coffee mug, but his expression remained calm. Still, there was a shift in the air, something you couldn't quite put your finger on. It wasn't fear. If anything, it felt like the calm before a storm. And in that moment, the diner wasn't just a place for a meal anymore. It was a stage, and everyone inside was about to witness a performance they'd never forget. Before we get into today's story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. If you love stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Now, let's get started. Frank sat motionless, the steam from his coffee curling into the air as if trying to escape the tension now filling the room. His eyes, still fixed on the horizon outside, carried a weight that told you he had seen storms far greater than the one brewing behind him. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead mixed with the clatter of boots against the tile as the bikers made their way deeper into the diner. The leader, Snake, the name likely inspired by the tattoo coiled around his neck, swaggered toward Frank's booth, his grin sharp and full of mockery. The other bikers followed, spreading out like a pack of wolves scenting blood. Frank's gaze didn't waver from the window, though his reflection in the glass caught every movement. "Hey, old-timer," Snake barked, slamming a hand on Frank's table, making the coffee ripple in its mug. "You deaf, or just too proud to say hello?" Frank finally moved, just barely. His hand shifted to his spoon, stirring the coffee slowly, as if Snake's words were nothing more than background noise. Inside, though, something was stirring, something deep, something raw. It wasn't fear. It was a familiar, simmering frustration, the kind a man carries when he's lived long enough to know that trouble finds you no matter how hard you try to avoid it. Around them, the diner's patrons were frozen, eyes darting nervously between Frank and the bikers. The waitress behind the counter gripped her order pad tightly, her knuckles white. No one dared to intervene, but you could feel the unspoken hope hanging in the air. "Let this end, quietly. Please." Frank finally spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of a man who had nothing left to prove. "I'm just trying to finish my coffee," he said, not looking up. Snake laughed, loud and abrasive. "Coffee, huh? Don't think you'll need the caffeine, old man. Things are about to get real interesting in here." He leaned in closer, his shadow falling over Frank's face. Frank tightened his grip on the mug again, the ceramic cool against his calloused palms. He took a slow breath, his mind flashing back to a time when men like Snake weren't just a nuisance. They were the kind of problem he'd been trained to eliminate. But that was a lifetime ago. A lifetime he'd worked hard to leave behind. As Snake chuckled and straightened up, he reached for Frank's coffee mug. "Let me help you out with that, cowboy," he sneered. But just as his fingers brushed the handle, Frank's hand moved. Not fast, not aggressive, but firm, planting itself over the mug like a steel trap. The diner went silent. Snake's grin faltered just for a second as Frank finally lifted his eyes to meet his. And in that moment, you could see it. The quiet, unshakable strength in Frank's gaze. It wasn't anger, wasn't fear. It was something far more dangerous. "You don't want to do that," Frank said, his voice calm but laced with a warning that cut through the room like a knife. And just like that, the tension snapped. Everyone leaned in, waiting to see what would happen next. The air in the diner was thick, charged with an invisible current that seemed ready to spark at any moment. Snake's grin returned, wider this time, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, we've got ourselves a tough guy," he drawled, glancing over his shoulder at his crew, who burst into laughter like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. "Look, boys, Grandpa thinks he's still got it." Frank didn't blink. His hand stayed firm on the mug, his expression unreadable. He didn't flinch when Snake leaned in closer, close enough for Frank to smell the cheap whiskey on his breath. "What are you gonna do, huh?" Snake taunted, his voice dropping to a low, threatening growl. "Show me some of that cowboy magic?" The leader's hand shot out, grabbing the brim of Frank's hat. He yanked it off, tossing it onto the floor like it was trash. The diner collectively gasped, the sound of the hat hitting the tile echoing louder than it should have. Frank's jaw tightened, but he didn't move, not yet. "You see," Snake continued, his voice loud and grating, "guys like you, you're relics. Dusty, useless, and you're sitting in our seat." His gang cheered, emboldened by their leader's performance. Frank's fingers flexed slightly, then relaxed. He didn't say a word, his silence as deliberate as it was unnerving. Snake mistook it for fear, mistook the calm for surrender. "Pick it up," Snake said, pointing to the hat on the floor. "Come on, Grandpa. Let's see how fast you can move those creaky old bones." Frank tilted his head, his piercing eyes locking onto Snake's. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, quiet, and yet it carried enough weight to make everyone strain to hear. "You want me to pick it up?" he asked, his tone laced with something so subtle and sharp it could cut glass. Snake leaned back, spreading his arms in mock invitation. "Yeah, old man, show me what you got." Frank slid out of the booth slowly, methodically, as if he had all the time in the world. He stood tall, his back straight despite his age, and for the first time, the room seemed to realize just how solidly built he still was. The lines on his face weren't just from age, they were from battles fought and survived. He bent down, his movements deliberate, and picked up the hat. But instead of putting it back on, he dusted it off carefully, his focus on the task as though Snake and his gang weren't even there. The silence in the diner was deafening, everyone on edge, waiting to see what would happen next. Then Frank looked up, and something shifted. The calm in his expression hardened, turning into something colder, sharper. He placed the hat on the table, his hands steady as stone. "You've had your fun," he said, his voice even but carrying an edge that could cut through the tension like a knife. The gang laughed again, but this time it sounded forced, uneasy. Snake stepped closer, towering over Frank. "What's the matter, cowboy? Did I hurt your feelings?" he sneered, shoving Frank's shoulder. Frank didn't stumble, didn't even sway. Instead, his eyes bored into Snake's, and when he spoke again, his words came slow and deliberate, each one like a loaded gun. "I'm giving you one chance. Walk away. Now." The laughter stopped. Snake froze, caught off guard by the sheer conviction in Frank's voice. Around the room, the tension thickened to the point where even breathing felt loud. Snake's hand curled into a fist, his ego refusing to let him back down. "You really think you can—" he started, but Frank cut him off. "I've seen men like you before," Frank said, his voice low, his tone colder than ice. "Loud, reckless, always looking for a fight. But you don't know what a fight really is." Snake's smirk wavered, just for a moment. And in that moment, the balance of power in the room shifted. Frank stood there, silent and unmoving, as if daring Snake to test him. The leader's jaw tightened, his bravado faltering under the weight of the storm brewing behind Frank's eyes. Snake's hesitation was brief, but it was enough for the rest of the gang to notice. One of them muttered something under his breath just loud enough to cut through the tension, and Snake, desperate to save face, took a step forward. But before he could make his next move, Frank did something that stopped everyone cold. He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable, and said, "You've already made your first mistake." Snake's smirk twisted into a scowl as Frank's words settled over the room like a dark cloud. The leader's bravado flickered, but his pride refused to let him back down. "Mistake?" he spat, stepping even closer. "The only mistake here is you thinking you can talk to me like that." Frank didn't flinch. He stood there, still as a mountain, his eyes steady and calm, but there was something electric beneath the surface, a quiet tension that made everyone hold their breath. "Your first mistake," Frank said slowly, his voice like a low rumble of thunder, "was thinking, I'm someone you can intimidate." The rest of the gang exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier laughter now replaced by a creeping sense of unease. Something about Frank, the way he stood, the way he spoke, was starting to unnerve them. He wasn't angry, wasn't rattled. He was just waiting. Snake, however, wasn't ready to admit he'd lost control of the room. He leaned in close, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you're some kind of tough guy, huh? What are you going to do, old man? Teach me a lesson?" Frank's gaze didn't waver. "If I have to," he said simply, and those 4 words hit harder than any threat could. Snake laughed, loud and hollow, but it didn't have the same bite as before. "All right, boys," he called over his shoulder. "Let's show Grandpa what happens when you mess with the wrong crowd." The gang began to move, their heavy boots echoing on the diner floor as they circled Frank's booth like sharks scenting blood. One of them grabbed a chair, spinning it around and dropping into it with a sneer. Another leaned against the counter, eyeing the waitress who was frozen in place, her hands trembling as she clutched her order pad. Frank's eyes flicked briefly to her, then back to Snake. "You're making your second mistake," he said, his voice still calm, but now there was a razor-sharp edge to it. Snake's nostrils flared. "Oh yeah? And what's that?" "You're involving people who don't deserve it," Frank replied, his voice dropping just enough to send a chill through the room. The waitress took an instinctive step back, her wide eyes darting between Frank and the bikers. The cook peeked out from the kitchen, a frying pan clutched in one hand like it was a shield. The other patrons were frozen in their seats, caught between fear and morbid curiosity. Snake chuckled darkly, spreading his arms as if to show off his control of the room. "You hear that, boys? Grandpa thinks he's the sheriff now." Frank didn't respond. Instead, he straightened his posture, his shoulders broad and unyielding. For the first time, the bikers noticed the way his hands moved. Slow, deliberate, like someone who had done this kind of thing before. Snake noticed too, and his confidence wavered, if only for a moment. The tension ratcheted up another notch as Snake took another step forward, now just inches from Frank. "You think you're better than me?" he snarled. Frank met his gaze, unblinking. "No," he said quietly. "I just think I've got nothing left to lose." Those words hit like a hammer, the weight of them pulling the air out of the room. Snake hesitated, but before he could respond, Frank moved. It wasn't fast, but it was precise. Frank's hand shot out and grabbed Snake's wrist before he even saw it coming. The room gasped as Frank tightened his grip, his knuckles turning white against Snake's skin. The leader's confident smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of surprise and pain. "You've got a choice," Frank said, his voice steady and controlled, like he wasn't even breaking a sweat. "Walk out of here now, and this ends. Or stay, and you'll find out what a real mistake feels like." Snake yanked his hand back, his bravado cracking under the pressure. He glanced at his gang, hoping for backup, but the unease on their faces mirrored his own. "You're bluffing," Snake said, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Frank didn't blink. "Try me," he said simply. The silence stretched thin, the tension in the room now unbearable. Snake's gang shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence evaporating with each passing second. The cook, still clutching his frying pan, muttered under his breath, "This is about to get ugly." Snake's pride warred with his instincts. His jaw tightened and his fists clenched, but there was no mistaking the doubt in his eyes. Frank, still as stone, didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared him down with a patience that was almost unnerving. And then, Snake took a step back. But his hesitation wasn't retreat. It was the calm before the storm. "All right," he said slowly, his voice dripping with malice. "You want to play tough? Let's see how far you're willing to take this." The air snapped taut as Snake reached into his jacket pocket, and the room collectively held its breath. The sound of Snake's hand brushing against the inside of his jacket pocket echoed through the diner like a gunshot. For a split second, the room held its breath. Frank's eyes flicked to Snake's hand, every muscle in his body coiled, ready for anything. But then something unexpected happened. Snake didn't pull a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He unfolded it with a deliberate slowness, his eyes darting between Frank and the rest of the room, the tension mounting in the space between them. Frank's gaze never wavered. "What's that?" he asked, his voice still calm, his hands now relaxed at his sides. Snake hesitated, looking down at the paper in his hands, his fingers trembling just slightly. For a moment he seemed lost in thought, as if the weight of the paper was suddenly too much for him to bear. Then, with a final flick of his wrist, he slammed it onto the table in front of Frank. The room went silent. Frank's eyes flicked to the paper. It wasn't a threatening letter, wasn't a ticket to trouble. It was a photo. The faded image of a younger man sitting in a chair, someone who looked strikingly familiar. The same stern eyes, the same unyielding posture. Frank's heart skipped a beat. The man in the photo wasn't just someone who looked like him. It was him. The realization hit him like a freight train. The memories rushed back, unbidden, memories of a time long buried, a time when he had been the one dishing out the pain, a time when his name had been feared, respected, before he became the man who had walked away from the chaos, from the violence, to try to find peace in the quiet corners of life. Frank's fingers twitched at his sides, but he kept himself composed. He wasn't that man anymore. He wasn't the man in the photo. Yet there it was, staring back at him. A piece of his past, dragged out into the light. Snake's voice broke through the silence, bitter and mocking. "Recognize him. That's your old buddy, Frank. Your old reputation." He leaned in closer, his words low and venomous. "You think you can just hide from who you really are? You think you can outrun this?" Frank's mind raced, but his expression remained unreadable. He hadn't been running from his past, not entirely, but this was different. "You're just a relic, old man," Snake continued, his voice sharp. "A faded memory, and I'm here to remind you who you really are." For a brief moment, Frank felt the old anger stir within him, the fire that had once driven him to survive in a world of blood and violence. But then, just as quickly, it settled into something far more dangerous. A calmness. He looked up at Snake, his eyes dark but resolute. "I'm not that man anymore," Snake sneered. "But you are. You always will be. And when the chips are down, you'll show your true colors. You can't outrun your past, Frank." But as Snake spoke, Frank realized something far more dangerous than any physical confrontation. He wasn't afraid of his past. He was afraid of becoming that man again. The twist came in that realization. The fear was never about Snake or the bikers. It was about himself, about the truth he had buried so deep. He could leave behind the violence, but could he ever escape who he had been? Frank took a slow, deliberate step back, his gaze never leaving Snake's. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice cool, "but you won't make me show it." The tension in the room crackled as Frank stood taller, his eyes locked with Snake's. He had made a choice in that moment, not to let the past control him, not to let Snake, or anyone, drag him back into the darkness. Snake's grin faltered just for a moment. He didn't expect Frank to be unmoved, unshaken. The smug confidence that had been his armor began to crack. But before he could say another word, Frank's next words cut through the room like a blade. "You've already lost," Frank said simply. The air shifted. Snake's confidence faltered. And that, more than anything, was the turning point. The silence in the diner stretched long after Frank's words hung in the air. Snake stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides, and for the first time, the bikers surrounding him seemed unsure, shifting their weight from foot to foot. Frank's steady gaze never wavered, but a flicker of something, a quiet understanding, passed through his eyes. The tension was no longer about proving strength, but about something deeper. Snake blinked, his jaw tightening as he processed Frank's unshakable calm. His eyes darted toward his gang, who were now looking at him instead of Frank. There was a shift, subtle but noticeable. The power had slipped from Snake's hands and into Frank's. The biker gang had come here to intimidate an old man, but now they were faced with someone who had nothing left to fear. Frank's mind, however, was elsewhere. He was still standing, still calm, but in his mind's eye he saw the face of the younger man from the photo, his younger self, the man he had once been, who had caused so much pain. The anger, the rage, it all seemed so far away now, like something he had once worn but had long since discarded. The cost of that life had been too high. He had paid for it with years of isolation, with peace bought at the price of his past. But now, the question lingered. Was the peace worth it? The room held its breath as Snake took a slow step back, his confidence crumbling with each passing second. Frank wasn't looking for a fight. He wasn't looking for violence. He wasn't the man he had been. But the consequences of his past actions hung over him, like a shadow that refused to fade. He had tried to bury the old man, to leave that life behind. But what if that old man still lived within him? What if the anger he'd tried to outrun was just waiting for the right moment to rise again? Snake spat, breaking the silence, but there was no fire in it now, just frustration. "You think you've won," he growled. "You're just as weak as the rest of them." Frank's voice was steady when he spoke. "I'm not weak. I just don't have anything left to prove." A long, uncomfortable pause followed. Snake's grip tightened around his jacket, but his eyes never met Frank's. The rest of the gang stood awkwardly, unsure of what to do next. Frank could feel the weight of their gaze, but he didn't let it affect him. He had long since learned to carry his own weight without needing validation from others. And yet, something about the way Snake had stepped back, something about the fear now evident in his eyes, struck Frank in an unexpected way. He wasn't afraid of the bikers. He was afraid of what they had stirred within him, of what they had made him face. The cook in the back let out a breath as if he too had been holding it in. The waitress took a hesitant step toward Frank, her eyes wide as though she couldn't believe what she'd just witnessed. The rest of the diner was still frozen in place, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. And Snake, for all his bluster, was now a man undone. His swagger, his bravado, everything that had defined him in the past, was gone. In that one moment, the walls he'd built around himself had crumbled, revealing a man who had never truly been in control. Frank's gaze softened, but there was no smile. "Walk away," he said, his voice still unwavering. "You don't want to finish this." Snake looked at him for a long moment, his mind racing, the anger within him swirling, but the realization was there, plain and undeniable. He wasn't going to win this. Not today. Without another word, Snake turned and walked out, his gang following in silence, their footsteps heavy but reluctant. The diner remained silent, as if afraid to break the fragile peace that had been established. But Frank stood there, unmoving, watching them leave. He wasn't victorious. He wasn't angry. He was simply tired. Tired of the violence. Tired of the fear. He had walked away from all of that once, and as the bikers disappeared into the night, Frank knew that, for the first time in a long while, he had made the right choice. Yet even as the tension in the room started to lift, Frank couldn't help but wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't walked away? That thought stayed with him, echoing in the quiet of the diner as the last of the bikers vanished through the door. As the last of the bikers disappeared into the night, the diner began to return to its normal rhythm. The clink of dishes, the murmur of quiet conversations. Everything seemed to slowly come back to life. But for Frank, the silence in his own mind was louder than any noise in the room. The weight of what had just happened settled over him like a heavy blanket. He wasn't sure what he had expected from the confrontation. Maybe a rush of triumph, a sense of finality, but there was none of that. What he felt was something deeper, something he hadn't anticipated, the realization that he was free, not just from the bikers or the past, but from the chains he had unknowingly forged around himself. Frank glanced at the table where the photo had once been. He didn't need to look at it again to know what it meant. That man in the photo, the younger version of himself, would never come back. That life, that world, had been left behind. He had changed. He was no longer defined by the violence or the anger or the reputation he had once clung to. The waitress, still standing at the counter, watched him quietly. Her earlier nervousness had faded, replaced by a quiet respect. She had seen something in Frank tonight, something that even Snake hadn't expected. She slowly approached him, offering a small, tentative smile. "You're not what I thought you'd be," she said, her voice soft but sincere. Frank gave her a brief, almost imperceptible nod. "I'm not what anyone thinks," he replied, his voice steady, though there was a hint of something more beneath the surface. The cook, too, stepped forward, wiping his hands on his apron. "We could use a guy like you around here," he said with a chuckle, though his eyes were serious. Frank smiled, the first real smile he'd shown all night. It wasn't a smile of victory or pride. It was the smile of someone who had come to terms with who he was, someone who had made peace with the person he had been and the person he was becoming. But as the moments passed, a realization settled in. Frank didn't need the respect of the bikers or the approval of others. The truth was simple. He had made a choice to leave behind the life that had once defined him, to walk away from the man who had fought tooth and nail to hold on to his power, his anger, and his reputation. The lesson had been clear. Peace wasn't something you found in the absence of conflict. It was something you built, piece by choosing to change, even when it seemed easier to stay the same. The diner was quieter now, the last echoes of the confrontation fading into the past. Frank turned toward the door, feeling the weight of his choices settling into his bones. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't afraid. He had chosen to move forward, and there was no turning back. With one final glance at the table, Frank stepped outside, into the night. The air was cool, the streets empty, but for the first time in years, Frank felt a sense of calm he hadn't known in a long time. It wasn't the calm of a man who had won a battle. It was the calm of someone who had found a way to let go of the fight altogether. As he walked down the quiet street, the lesson was clear in his mind. Sometimes the greatest strength is in walking away. As Frank walked away from the diner, the streets stretched out before him, quiet and still. He had made his choice, and for the first time he felt the weight of it lift, replaced with something far lighter: freedom. But as you watch this story unfold, take a moment to reflect. How often do we find ourselves holding on to the past, fighting battles that no longer serve us? Maybe there's a part of you that's afraid to let go, afraid to move forward. Or perhaps you've already taken that step, leaving behind the old versions of yourself in search of something more peaceful, more fulfilling. Whatever your journey, remember, it's not about how hard you fight, but about knowing when to walk away. If this story resonated with you, take a second to share it. Reflect on your own path and consider what you might need to leave behind in order to find peace. And don't forget to comment below. What does the lesson of letting go mean to you? Keep moving forward. Keep growing. The best is yet to come.